Still on the topic of chronic adaptations here, but I'll just split the lesson into aerobic adaptations, and then this lesson is going to focus on anaerobic adaptations. So as a result of anaerobic training, which is training in a manner where you are at a high intensity, a high enough intensity where oxygen is not readily enough available to produce all of the ATP you require. So you've got increased contributions by your anaerobic energy systems. So anaerobic training is going to enhance your body's ability to make ATP anaerobically. The changes that we see occur typically in your cardiovascular and your muscular systems. Any changes from your respiratory system are pretty negligible, so we don't address them. So essentially, anaerobic training increases the capacity of your ATP-PC and your anaerobic glycolysis systems to make ATP. Chronic adaptations from anaerobic training will improve performance in events that require anaerobic capacity, strength, power, speed. So this is a relatively short couple of slides. Our cardiovascular adaptations are relatively brief, and I've just left it to what's on this slide here as a summary. I would take a guess that most questions you get about cardiovascular adaptations will most likely be linked to aerobic training. But as a result of anaerobic training, you will also have an increased heart size, but that is due to an increased thickness in the wall of the left ventricle, which was also something that happened in aerobic training. So increased left ventricle wall thickness enables the left ventricle to contract more forcefully, which enables you to eject blood from the heart more forcefully. But there's no change in left ventricle volume. So the left ventricle itself does not increase in volume size. Therefore, there's actually no change in stroke volume. So anaerobic training does not increase your stroke volume. In terms of blood pressure, anaerobic trained athletes generally have a lower resting and submax blood pressure compared to untrained athletes. And what we'll do now is we'll go through each of our muscular adaptations, looking at what occurs in our fuel stores, our glycolytic enzymes, enzyme called ATPase, our tolerance of metabolic byproducts, adaptations in muscle size, and adaptations in motor unit recruitment. With anaerobic training and using your anaerobic energy system, you need to have a think about what is it using as a fuel source, and what is the pathway of breaking down that fuel source to produce ATP. So your ATP-PC system is using phosphocreatine as a fuel source, and it's got a pretty simple biochemical pathway to break that down to produce ATP. Your anaerobic glycolysis system is using glycogen or glucose as a fuel source, still a relatively simple biochemical pathway to break that down to produce ATP, but a pathway nonetheless, so it's still going to require enzymes. So with our first two adaptations, what we would see is an increase in your intramuscular stores, so an increase in how much ATP, glycogen and phosphocreatine you're storing in your muscle. And you would notice that increase in your type 2 muscle fibres, and mainly in your type 2B. You wouldn't really notice much of a difference in the storage of those things in your type 1 as a result of anaerobic training. So increased energy level substrates gives us more fuel at the site of the muscle to be able to break down. Then we have an increase in our glycolytic enzymes. So your glycolytic enzymes are your ones that are involved in anaerobic glycolysis, so breaking the glucose down into pyruvate and then converting that pyruvate into lactic acid, which essentially dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions. So we would have an increase in the number of glycolytic enzymes, so more enzymes available to break the glucose down into pyruvate and lactic acid, Therefore, we can break it down more quickly and essentially produce ATP more quickly. There's another enzyme called ATPase. ATPase is the enzyme that catalyzes or speeds up the reaction when we convert ATP into ADP plus PI. So remember when we snap off that third phosphate to release energy to be used by the muscle. So having increased number and increased activity of ATPase, we can actually convert ATP to ADP more quickly, therefore providing the muscles with that energy that's released at a faster rate. So combined with the increase in glycogen stores, the increase in glycolytic enzymes and ATPase increases your ability to produce ATP via anaerobic glycolysis. The increased stores of phosphocreatine are essentially what's increasing your ability to make ATP through ATP-PC. We've just finished saying that you have an increased rate of making ATP through anaerobic glycolysis. With that will come an increased production of metabolic byproducts because you are producing more ATP. So to go hand in hand with that, we actually have increased tolerance of those metabolic byproducts as well. So we can work at higher levels with higher concentrations of those metabolic byproducts in our blood, with it affecting us less. The anaerobic adaptations on this slide refer specifically to anaerobic training in the form of resistance training, so weights type training. Whereas the other adaptations we just talked about, you could get those through short interval, medium interval training. So when we're specifically doing resistance training, here's some of the changes we'll see occurring in your body. You'll have increased muscle size, and let's face it, that is why a lot of people do resistance training in the first place. So we have muscle hypertrophy, and the reason the muscles get larger is because we increase the number and the size of the myofibrils and the contractile proteins, being actin and myosin, that are in the muscle. We also increase the size and the strength of the connective tissues, so the tendons which join your muscle to your bone and the ligaments which connect your bone to your bone. So you're getting larger muscles due to those reasons. Larger muscles is a good thing because there is a direct relationship between the size of your muscle, so the cross-sectional area, and your strength. So the larger the cross-sectional area of your muscle, the more strength you have. With muscle fibers, muscle cells are a type of cell that don't really keep undergoing mitosis and producing new cells all of the time. Don't worry if you don't know what mitosis is. So the actual number of your muscle fibers does not change. So you've still got the same amount of muscle cells, muscle fibers. What's changed is just how large each fiber actually is. Being anaerobic training, you're going to see the greatest increases in your type 2B muscle fibers. Minimal changes in your type 1 because they're not really used in anaerobic activity, not as much anyway. So by increasing the size of your type 2B, they will increase their contribution to the total area they're taking up in that muscle compared to the slow twitch. Talked about one aspect that makes your muscles larger being the fact that inside your muscle fibers you're increasing the number of contractile proteins. So along with increasing the size of your muscle, that's also going to increase the ability of your muscle to contract. So we say it's an increased contractile capacity, which means it can essentially contract more forcefully. Benefit of having larger muscles, besides being able to look half decent in a singlet at summertime, is that they can store more fuel stores. So larger muscles can store more ATP. Larger muscles store more phosphocreatine, they store more glycogen. Therefore, it's more readily available and in larger quantities to be broken down to produce ATP to supply to the muscles when you're working. With your connective tissue, So remember we said that strengthens and it thickens. So the benefit of that is you can actually apply or generate greater force when you're moving your body. When your body is essentially full of lots of different levers. Those levers are joined together bone to bone by your ligaments, and they're controlled by your muscles, getting held to the bone by your tendons. So the thicker they are, the more force you can generate when you're going through those movements. So that's the muscle size itself, the muscle fibers. If you think back to how a muscle actually contracts, you have your nervous system, which sends a message to your muscle via what we call a motor neuron to tell that muscle to contract. So we have what we call motor units, which you guys have talked about earlier on in the year. So a motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it's responsible for contracting. So we also get some adaptations in our motor unit recruitment. What we do say is your neural adaptations, so neural being another word for nervous system, so talking about your ability to send messages to your muscles. We would see changes in those neural messages before we see changes in the actual muscle size. So after a few weeks of starting at the gym, you will be stronger. You'll feel stronger, you'll lift heavier weight, and you will be stronger. What we're saying is that increase in strength in those early stages of training is not because you've increased the cross-sectional area of your muscle. Your muscles haven't really grown yet, but it's because you have increased the efficiency of those messages getting sent from your motor neurons to your muscles. So we have increased motor unit recruitment, which means your motor neuron is recruiting more muscle fibers, and the more muscle fibers we recruit, the more force we produce. Along with recruiting more muscle fibers, we're actually recruiting more of what we call our high threshold motor units, which is our fast twitch fibers. Along with recruiting more, we're actually recruiting them more frequently. So we're sending messages to them to get them contracting more frequently. And by recruiting more and contracting them more frequently, you will increase your force production, your power, and the duration that you can actually maintain a muscle contraction. And all of those things will improve your performance in any movements that need those really quick, powerful movements. We also talk about motor unit coordination. So if you're doing a bench press and you've never ever done one before, or you see someone do one that's never ever done one, you'll notice that their technique is pretty ordinary. The bar won't be balanced, and that will affect how much they can lift. Like most things, the more you practice and the more you do things, your body lays down pathways through its nervous system that essentially makes your body remember how to do them. And you remember how to do them with less thinking about how to do them. And purely just having a more coordinated recruitment system, that will actually increase the amount of force and the efficiency of the force you produce as well.